Logging is a big part of app development. You should always include some logging in your apps to help you diagnose problems once those apps are deployed and being used. There are entire courses in the Pluralsight library on logging, so I won't go into too much detail here. But I think it's important to discuss, especially now that you have an idea of the type of information your application can emit that can help you with debugging, if you're able to capture it from the application after it's been deployed. Earlier, we talked about writing messages to trace listeners using debug.writeline. Those are removed from the release compilation of the app, though. If you replaced all those debug.writeline statements with trace.writeline, they would end up in the released code and could write to the same trace listeners. The trace class is one of the first methods of logging introduced in .NET. But this isn't how logging is typically implemented these days. .NET has a framework called iLogger, which is intended to abstract logging implementation. It's used by default in ASP.NET web applications, and you can also add it to any kind of app. In ASP.NET, it's configured for you at startup, and you can include a logger in the constructor of any class through dependency injection. I'll show you how simple it is in the upcoming demo. Then you write log statements throughout your code, and the log messages get sent to logging providers, which are similar to the trace listeners you learned about earlier. .NET has built-in logging providers that are easy to configure. In fact, most of the configuration is done in the appsettings.json file. If you've gone through the documentation for trace listeners, you saw configuration examples in XML. That's not possible since .NET Core was introduced, because we now use JSON files. That's why the configuration examples that you saw earlier used code. But iLogger is fully configurable through the JSON config file, at least for the built-in logging providers. There's a logging provider that writes to the console, and a logging provider that writes messages to the output window in Visual Studio. So far, logging providers just sound like trace listeners, right? Well, they have some additional functionality, actually, like the console logging provider has support for custom formatting, like color formatting of messages and JSON output. There's also a logging provider for the event log on Windows machines. But then there's also a logging provider for the event source framework, which is a low-level cross-platform logging system that allows you to use tools to connect to your app and listen for log information. Event source is used extensively by the framework code, so it's a way to integrate with deeper monitoring. But iLogger is a framework. It's an interface where other logging providers can be plugged in as destinations. So Microsoft has logging providers that are Azure-specific. You can configure logging for web apps deployed to Azure App Service, which can write their logs to the file system in Azure, where they can be accessed or even streamed in real time. Or the logs can be written to Azure Blob Storage, which is a file storage service in Azure. And there's also a logging provider for Azure Application Insights. Application Insights is a service that lets you monitor applications from a central location in Azure, and you can collect information from inside your application, in addition to the logging data, and also things like visitor usage patterns, which are actually collected from outside the code. Application Insights is a big topic, way beyond this course, but it's just an example of how iLogger is a flexible way to log that kind of future-proofs your application. There are lots of third-party frameworks for logging too. Some of them are complete replacements for iLogger, but a lot of them actually integrate with the iLogger framework, so you can continue writing messages in the same way inside your code. But by configuring a third-party logging provider, you can log to other destinations. And being that iLogger is a framework, you can also implement the interfaces yourself and write your own logging provider. So next, let's see a demo of how you can configure logging in a web app and how you can filter the level of logging that you want to do.